Good morning, everybody. And as Ms. Felkai said, welcome to the last day of Women in Science Week. It is without further delay that I would like to introduce Kailey Karakwinehtha Nicholas. She's a Vanier alumna and is also currently studying biology at Bishop's University. Today, she will teach us about two-eyed seeing, which is an Indigenous way of knowing. And she'll be talking about how she has actually bridged the gap between two-eyed seeing and science to grant her a new perspective to the natural world.
Thank you so much, Angelica. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to go into sharing my screen right away because that's essentially going to be my presentation is this PowerPoint I made, but I just figured it'd be nice for you to actually see my face and see what I look like. So I'm going to start that right now. Okay, so this is, and I emphasize introduction to two-eyed seeing, because if I really did a whole thorough presentation of this concept, we'd probably be here for hours because there's just so much to say and so much to talk about. But this is just my perspective from what I understand of this concept and how I use it and apply it to my daily life. And so just to give a bit of background, I mean, Angelica already kind of gave the basics, but my name is Kailey Karakwinehtha Nicholas. I'm a member of the Karakwinehtha Nation from Karakwinehtha, and I just recently graduated from Vanier College in the Environmental and Wildlife Management program. And I'm currently now at Bishop's University, hopefully going to end up with a Bachelor of Science in the Biodiversity and Ecology concentration. And so I guess my journey into the sciences is a bit of a rocky road. I wasn't somebody where when I was a kid, I knew right away that I didn't have a dream of being a scientist or anything. And in high school, I took chemistry and I took the physics and the high math just because I knew it would open up more doors, but I wasn't planning on going into the sciences at all right away. I had went into liberal arts at first at John Abbott and realized that definitely wasn't for me. And then I finally went into Vanier and realized, oh my God, this is it. This is perfect. But it's something that I feel like most people don't realize, but being an Indigenous person in the sciences is very, it's pretty isolating. And it kind of caused me to have a lot of like identity issues, if you will. I think because growing up, I went to school on reserve for the most part. And so I received all the cultural teachings about nature and learning from that perspective, kind of having an introduction to science, if you will, from a very early age. And this image of me that you see of me to the left is I must have been about 4 years old, and I was at this camping ground that I'm going to talk about later, actually, called Jorodu. That's a traditional territory used by members of Karakwinehtha and Kahnawake. And so it's just an area that has a lot of nice natural land and lakes, and we would just go there camping every now and then. And so I already grew up surrounded by nature. Even just in my own house, I had a pretty big backyard, and my parents are always telling me that I was, even from a very young age, they could see that I was very curious about the natural world. I was always playing with bugs and like always kind of just observing things and being very fascinated by it. But in my high school age, I never would have considered myself to be going into the sciences at all. Because a part of me almost felt like by choosing that life, by choosing city life, having to go off reserve to obtain my education and communicating and working with predominantly non-Indigenous people, which for some people on reserve can almost be seen as like talking with the enemy, if you will, because not only is it non-Indigenous, but it's also working from a colonial institution, right? Just education systems in general are like by default associated with those powers. And so it's kind of tricky navigating the world of Western academia as an Indigenous person, because you almost feel like you're betraying your people by choosing the Western way of thinking and the Western way of doing things. And so I struggled a lot with kind of feeling like, yeah, like I was a traitor or that I wasn't good enough for the sciences because of my Indigenous background and vice versa. And it was either my first or second year at Vanier, and I was at the Jake's Co-op bookstore, my favorite place, and I stumbled upon this book, and it changed me. It sounds so cheesy, but I don't know, I don't have any other way to put it. Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. It's I saw the cover and I was immediately like, I need this book, because it's not very often that I see sweetgrass, which is one of my people's medicines, on the cover of a book. And better yet, it's also about scientific knowledge and indigenous wisdom. So I fell in love with this book, and I hold it dear to my heart, and I recommend it to people, no matter what their field is, no matter what their background, because it's so incredible. And it was the first time I was introduced to this concept of two-eyed seeing, because to me, I'd never even knew that they could coexist, the Western ways of knowing and indigenous ways of knowing. And so this was about, yeah, 2-3 years ago, and I've been trying to learn about it ever since, and to teach others about it, because it's really not that popular of a concept quite yet. And so two-eyed seeing, to give a very general definition, is it's a guiding principle, and it's also an indigenous framework that covers all aspects of our life. So it's not limited to the sciences, but that's just the context that I'll be speaking about it in. But it can also impact social, economic, environmental parts of our lives, as well as just, again, a guiding principle. And I really like this definition of this term, Iriwaptamunk. It's a Mi'kmaq term coined in 2004 by a Mi'kmaq elder, Albert Marshall, and he defined it as the Mi'kmaq translation of two-eyed seeing. And the way that he defines it is that it's an integration of indigenous and Western worldviews or forms of knowledge. But they also emphasize in their culture that it centers on a really important cultural conservation concept, Natukulumik, where ecological integrity is maintained for the next 7 generations. And this concept of 7 generations as well is very popular in other Indigenous cultures of Canada that I know of. It's in my culture that for one example, and it's what I kind of like to call is like the original model of sustainability. And that's kind of something I'll talk a bit about now, of how you have all these new words coined by white people these days, of permaculture and sustainability and agroecology, but these are just things that our people have always done, because we've always had it in our values to make sure that we take care of the earth and our people to sustain it for the next 7 generations. So I always just kind of find it interesting when it's almost deemed as a new concept, but this is not new to a lot of different cultures around the world. And for my culture specifically, Karakwinehtha, this is something, if you can see in the background, it's what's called as the two-row wampum belt. And this is like a physical representation of a treaty that was made way back in the 17th century with the Haudenosaunee people of Eastern New York and some Dutch settlers that came in. And so the white beads on top, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse moving around, but even if, the white beads at the top, in the middle, and at the bottom, they represent a body of water. And then the two purple rows in the middle represent the two different vessels and the two different ways of life of our people, the Haudenosaunee, and the non-locals, these Dutch settlers, the colonizers, if you will. And the idea was kind of that they recognized we have to learn how to get along with each other and how to live with each other without interfering with one another's ways of lives. And so the idea is that the fact that they're parallel but on the same belt represents this peaceful coexistence, where you could have the Haudenosaunee doing what they do, taking care of their land the way that they know, staying in their own canoe, whereas the Dutch would stay in their ships and stay on, basically stay in your lane, right? Like a literal representation of that. And so this concept, this treaty idea, can also be thought of as a way of also viewing two-eyed seeing. That's how I understood it, especially because this is from my own culture, so it's something that I already knew of otherwise. And this is a diagram that kind of just outlines the main differences between it. And so on the left, you have indigenous ways of knowing, where a lot of our knowledge systems are based off of oral systems. So a lot of our knowledge was passed on through storytelling and just speaking with people as opposed to writing it down. We actually don't even have a traditional written language, the Haudenosaunee. And so that's why our spellings can be a bit difficult to grasp, and learning the language is a lot different for newer generations, because traditionally you would learn the language just by listening to it. So that's just something I wanted to mention. But yeah, and this is kind of in contrast to the Western ways of doing things, which is a lot of written systems. Another contrast would be things that we do are based off of ceremony, and things that are things that we hold dear to our heart. They're things that they're important in terms of spirituality and connection. Whereas Western ways of knowing is, codes of conduct. It's kind of it's basic, it gets to the point, And then another thing would be we follow things more along the lines of natural law, whereas Western ways of knowing is more about policies. So this is kind of showing that although they contrast, they're not entirely different. Right, like they're both systems of delivering information, whether it be oral or written. They're both ways of kind of respecting the way that things work in terms, whether it be a code of conduct or whether it just be natural law that we've noticed. And so another way to kind of view it is that indigenous ways of seeing things and understanding things is that there's a basis of interconnectedness. Whereas in the Western ways, right, it's all very individualistic and trying to isolate everything and separate it and compartmentalize it and organize it. But with indigenous ways of knowing, it's a bit more lenient in that it recognizes that you can't fully separate components of nature, specifically in terms of nature, because that's just not the way they work. You can't, right? Like this idea of organization and even taxonomy and everything, that's the human way of trying to understand it, but that's not the way things actually are, which is kind of where indigenous ways of knowing tend to go towards. Indigenous ways of knowing are also based off of tradition. They're based off of experience, of millennia of observation. Whereas the Western ways is, there's a very strict way of doing things. There's a code of conduct, like we said, there's policies, there's a step-by-step process in how you do it. And this whole graph isn't to show that one's better than the other or one's more efficient than the other, but just showing how side-by-side comparison, just how they differ and how beneficial it can be when you combine the tools and the powers that both systems have to offer. So this specifically in the context of sciences, I found this diagram that was from a research project that was all about the Saskatchewan River Delta. And so on the left, you could kind of see that where the Western side comes in, where you have, the numbers and the specific ways of measuring things, specific figures and trends. Whereas the indigenous knowledge is more about, again, like we saw in the diagram before, it's experiential. It's generations after generations of observation of ecology and attaching meaning to it as well. And I'll kind of go into why I think that's important. Even in the sciences, when we're so used to associating science with you're separating all emotion and separating all human connection. But I really just like this diagram because then it shows, literally bridging the gap between them. And so you're able to measure trends and figures, but you could also still provide and incorporate that generational knowledge and observation, and you could still attach meaning to it. So then in the end, you get a really well-rounded way of doing things. Not only do you understand it better, right? It's more complete because each one might be lacking in one aspect or another, and combining them together just makes like a perfect kind of solution to any issues that you might have with sticking to one knowledge form or the other. And so this slide is definitely something that this is my perception of it. It is by no means a fact. This is just how I kind of noticed how the point of views differ when it comes to learning about plants. And one thing that I think is important is to talk about the way that just the power of language in general, the way that you speak about things can also end up influencing how you treat things. So for example, with modern science, the general point of view would be you have the scientist is observing a plant, and a plant being very objectified. It's an it. and then the researcher would discover something about it, something about the way that it functions. But I think my issue with this take is that because again it's objectifying it, and so it's a lot easier to exploit things and to disrespect them if they're not living, if they're just if they're just things. And another thing that I don't like about it is when, researchers or scientists, they discovered something. They discovered a function of an enzyme in this plant. But it's not so much that you discovered it, you didn't know about it before, you didn't know how to explain it. And so I think with modern science, there's kind of like the human ego, I think, gets a bit too involved. It's very about, I did this, I managed this plant, I was able to manipulate nature. Whereas in the Indigenous point of view, it's a lot more based off of, we're on a common ground. There's no hierarchy of human beings at the top of this grand food chain because we're so smart and we can take care of anything. If anything, if you think about it, because plants and a lot of animals and even microbes have been here for years and years and years, longer than us on this earth, you'd think they would have the most knowledge of how to live successfully. And you see that in the way that we design technology. A lot of the times it's based off of things that are already living, like dragonflies and the way that they fly, and birds when they created airplanes. Like it's not a coincidence, right? They modeled it after nature because nature has had all these years ahead of us to perfect itself. And so when it comes to observing this, if it's an experiment, you'd have a scientist is not observing something, it's having a conversation with its teacher, with its sibling, with it's just another being in the grand life, all the life forms that we have. And the only thing that this researcher is doing is just translating. It's not discovering, it's not it's responsible for doing anything. Like, all the credit has to go to the plant because they're the one that came up with this sophisticated system of doing something. And then so the researcher is then just in charge of translating that into a language that we can understand. And so I think when you use it this way, when it's not it's a teacher, or even viewing it as like a sibling, it's a lot harder to exploit or disrespect it because it's your loved one. So it's just, if you care for something, right, you're gonna be more respectful of it. It's a lot easier to mismanage plants when it's just but when you attach that value to it, it makes it more special. And I think as humans, we're a lot more likely to think twice before we do something to it. And I also just like this point of view because, again, it removes any of that human ego involved. It's not so much we discovered something, it's, oh, we understand this now about this cool, sophisticated teacher of ours. And as amazing as this two-eyed seeing principle is, it doesn't come without issues. And again, this is something that I've noticed from my point of view. I've noticed that just in general, the main issues, regardless of which party it's coming from, there's a fundamental misunderstanding that Indigenous ways of knowing and Western ways of knowing are mutually exclusive, that they're opposites, that they can't work together because they're so contrasting and they come from completely different values and different perspectives. I disagree with that, as we'll see. And as you might have seen already, they do have a way of being interconnected, and both of them have benefits and tools that they can offer. When it comes to the Western side, there is definitely a lot of skepticism and a lack of credibility in traditional knowledge from modern scientists. One example that I could think of is prescribed burns. Prescribed burning, if you're unfamiliar, is the using fire, like purposely lighting an area of land on fire for a bunch of different reasons. And Indigenous people all over North America have been doing this for thousands of years. And one of the reasons, it might seem a bit counterintuitive, why would you burn it if you need it? One example would be they recognize that certain pioneer plants, if an area is disturbed, for example, by a fire, there's going to be certain plants, certain species that start erupting and start growing before other species do. And these pioneer species are really, really yummy to a lot of game animals. And so they realize that if they kind of burn down an area, wait a little bit for the new fresh plants to grow, they have a whole cleared area where a bunch of game is going to come to feed. And so it's a lot easier to hunt that way. And they're also providing food for something. I remember reading, there's a lot of research on this if you're curious, but another reason would kind of help with pests, and just if it gives the land a bit of a break, especially if it was an area that was used for agriculture, it kind of recycles all the nutrients back into the earth. And so all this stuff is proven, but you know, when the Europeans first arrived and they started, you know, controlling the land and dictating what my people could and could not do, they made it illegal to do these prescribed burns because they didn't understand it. Because from their perspective, we were, you know, unsocialized, stupid Indians. What the hell are you doing burning down this forest? Without even, you know, considering, hey, these people have been here for a really, really long time. I think they might know what they're doing. Yeah, there's a paper about this actually by the same author that I mentioned before, Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer. So if you want to check that out, you literally just have to Google prescribed burns and Kimmerer, and you'll probably get the paper right away. Another example of skepticism that people get is, once again, from Robin Kimmerer's book. It's an example of when she was mentoring this woman when she was doing a research project on sweetgrass. And sweetgrass, like I mentioned before, is one of the 3 important traditional medicines for my people, but as well as, again, other Indigenous and First Nations cultures in North America, and even all around the world, if I'm not mistaken. And so sweetgrass can also be used to make baskets, and that's a really, really popular cultural and art form, especially in this region called Aguasasne, which is another Mohawk reservation that's just south of Cornwall. And a lot of these basket makers, again, because they're so closely connected to, you know, the land for generations and generations, they started noticing that the areas where they normally have sweetgrass growing were dwindling, and they weren't sure why, but they had a hunch that it had something to do with the harvesting techniques, because there's a lot of discourse in terms of what's the proper way to harvest sweetgrass. And it gets very complicated when you think about the fact that a lot of that knowledge was lost because of colonization and residential school and cultural genocide. So a lot of our traditional ways of doing things have been taken away from us. So this was kind of, they were wondering, well, do you just snip it a certain, you know, a couple inches from the root? Some people take the whole plant out when they harvest it. So there's a lot of discourse on that. So these basket weavers reached out to researchers and asked, can you help us figure out what's going on? And when these women kind of the researchers proposed this project to the professors, you know, in order to get funding and whatnot, they weren't really supportive of it because what the basket weavers were suggesting, and what the general Indigenous theory behind all this, is that if we use a plant respectfully, it will flourish. But if we ignore it, it will go away. And it sounds a little strange, but if you consider that this theory is the result of a millennia of observations of basket weavers, it kind of makes you wonder. I think we can, you know, give some credit to them. I think it's worth saying that they probably know their stuff, right? But to these old white men, it was, well, anyone knows that harvesting a plant will damage the population. And this one professor actually said to them, I don't find this whole traditional knowledge thing very convincing. Yeah, so that's incredibly frustrating, and especially also when I think about, for example, what's going on in Nova Scotia with the Mi'kmaq fishermen. It's crazy to me because, and I know I'm biased because I'm Indigenous myself, but I think it's kind of ridiculous that people have the nerve to say you don't know what you're doing because you're not doing Western science the way that we know, the way that we're used to doing it. But I think, if anything, just the sheer like experiences of all those fishermen is enough to kind of, you know, I think they know what they're doing. And so that's overall, that's just, I could keep talking about this clearly. So yeah, so a lot of skepticism in traditional knowledge, just in general, especially when it comes to management of nature and health. But coming from the actual indigenous side, there's also a lot of distrust in non-indigenous institutions or governments associated with Western society. And it frustrates me because I'm right in the middle, right? I think both forms of view are important and worthy of being said, and that they both offer tools, but you can't help but deny the history that our people have been wronged by non-indigenous people like almost every chance that they can get. And so it can get a bit tricky when, say, for example, there's some phenomena happening on a reserve, but they don't have the resources necessary to study it fully. So they might ask a researcher to come help. But many people in the community might be very uncomfortable about that because it's like you're having a stranger coming into your house and telling you what to do. And especially because we might not always know what the true intentions are of these non-Indigenous people. Yeah, this is a really tricky part of applying it. But I think, again, it all has to do, both of these, both the issues coming from both sides, all stem from the misunderstanding that they can be mutually inclusive. This is, again, another example of just, you know, a traditional knowledge is often ignored and discredited, but you can see it happening, that science ends up confirming what Indigenous people have been saying for centuries. One example is the role of our gut microbes and how it has an impact on our mental health. And this concept of, you know, the importance of digestive system, like, and how it affects your mental health is not a new thing when it comes to traditional Chinese medicine. But of course, nobody really believes it until it's proven through the Western science way. Another example would be there are very positive physiological effects of chanting, and chanting is a very common thing in a lot of Indigenous cultures. And now they're finding that it stimulates the vagus nerve, which is a nerve that goes throughout your entire body. So it's connected to almost like everything. And our Indigenous people have known that if that just the, or even in India with yoga, the chanting of the Om sequence, that's, it's not for nothing, right? Like, even if they maybe didn't have the exact science down to a T because it was, you know, the 1500s, I think it's safe to say they still know that there's a positive relationship to it. And then lastly, this is one, you know, an iconic one, is just connection to nature. And in my culture, for example, I know it's very emphasized to respect nature and to participate and interact with it because it's good for the soul. It's good for your mind, body, and soul and everything. And now they're actually finding, you know, the physiological reasons why this happens, and this whole concept of forest bathing. And again, they always give it a new name because they can't just it's as if, right, they're discovering something new even though it's been a part of people's cultures for thousands and thousands of years. And I'm going to go a bit about kind of, so once I started learning about two-eyed seeing, I kind of started looking back at teachings that I got as a kid that I didn't immediately associate with having anything to do with science, and now realizing once again, like, no, like, our people were ecologists, they were botanists, they were engineers, they were mathematicians, you know, like, even if we didn't have the same language of doing it, you're still doing it because you've got, you know, you're observing results, you're evaluating your findings, you're creating these management plans. That's experimental science. And after years and years, generations of data collection and validation, right? I think they're right. I think they know what they're doing. And so this this thing right here, the Honogari Wadekwa, it's very, very important to me. It's called The Words Before All Else, as it's translated, but it's also just known as our Thanksgiving address. And I was first exposed to this when I was in elementary school, because again, I did go to school for a portion of my education on the reservation, and so they implement a lot of cultural education. And so every morning we'd all gather in before going to classes. As soon as we get off the bus, we'd all gather in what we call the circle room, and we would go through this. We would all say together the words before all else, and it has the whole idea is that, and you could say it, a person could say it on their own in the morning to kind of get their mind in the right position. We said it as school children all together in the morning as well, but it could also be used before ceremony, before, there's a lot of different times when this spiritual address can be used. And the whole point is that it brings it's a phrase that's repeated often is that, and now our minds are one. So essentially what the Honagari Wadekwa is you're going through all the different aspects of nature and giving thanks that it exists. And so it ranges from giving thanks for each other, from people, to the sun, to the birds, to our medicines. And it all starts with this thing here. It makes me kind of sad because I've lost the language a bit, but just out of like muscle memory, I remember just the beginnings of this. So it always starts with Agwegun Oscar Andidawatwe Nuni Dano Ungwa Nigura Dano Deatino Horadu Ne. And then you'd say whatever it is that you're thankful for. So it starts off with this very common phrase. And then one example would be, we greet, thank, acknowledge, depending on the translation, the insects because they are working to make the earth good. And we greet, thank, acknowledge our grandfathers, the thunderers and bringers of rain because they renew the waters. And I don't think I realized it as a kid, but that's ecology right there, right? This is recognizing ecosystem services. And we even knew, thousands of years before Europeans came, the power and the role that insects play in ecology. And they're not just, these pests that fly around that are menaces the way that people view them nowadays, but they had a role. And that's something that's essential to again, I can't speak for all indigenous cultures, but for the Karakwinehtha teachings is that every single component of nature has a role, and the role as humans is to ensure that the cycles of life continue, and so to take care of all the other beings on earth, which differs from the biblical version in Genesis 1, where it's mankind now has dominion over everything and he controls it, where it seems more of like an ownership thing and like an entitlement because it's a right to, this is my land, I could do what I want with it. And so I think this is also another example as well of how our language shapes the way we behave. So if you're taught that these beings are sacred and they're special and you have to take care of them, I think the management plans for, a forest are going to be a lot more effective when you're viewing it from there, instead of just, oh, we need to take care of this because we need to make money from the lumber. Yeah, and so this Sahana Badekwa is just really awesome. I think, again, at just making people just be grateful for things, and that really it sets the day off right, Another thing, this is one of my favorite things to talk about as well, and I could honestly do a whole presentation on this, but there is a lot of information online, so if you want to do further research on this, I highly encourage you to do so, especially if you're into botany or even just engineering, because this is a genius system. And again, it wasn't just the Haudenosaunee people that did this, but indigenous cultures all over North America. And so this whole idea of the Three Sisters agriculture is basically what modern day companion planting. And so the idea is that first you plant corn, and once the corn gets to a certain length, then you plant your beans, and then you plant your squash. And it's all a very strategic way that they're grown in, because the idea is that the corn, and it's almost associated as well with being like, again, these are the three sisters, so the corn could be kind of seen as like the older sister. And this analogy, mind you, is not an original one. I read about it in Braiding Sweetgrass as well. But this is also just the tradition, like a folklore in general. Depending on which region you are, there are the stories that go with the three sisters that bring it to life, right? It's not just inanimate objects growing, but there's storytelling that could go behind it and lessons that can be learned. And so the corn, being the older sister, provides support. She's the eldest, so she stands the tallest. And she provides the support for the younger sister, the beans, to start growing on. And then the role of the corn, the squash, is because it has very prickly leaves. Not only does it help prevent the crops from pests, but it also shades the ground, which helps prevent weeds, and it also provides moisture and retains moisture in the soil a lot more. But the real kicker of this, I think, is that the beans, there's this whole ecosystem going on in the soil, right, with all microbes and everything. And so this is really common with any legume plant, but they develop these things called root nodules in their roots, as you might be able to see in this image, these tiny little circles they draw around the roots of the bean plants. And what they do is they convert atmospheric nitrogen into a form that's actually usable by plants. Nitrogen is an incredibly important nutrient for a lot of plants. It's essential in like how they build their DNA. And there's tons of nitrogen in the atmosphere, but the plants can't use it if it's in that specific gaseous form. So they have to wait until certain things like microbes can, what they call nitrogen fixing. So they fix it into a form that the plant can then use. And the way that they do this is that the legume plants send out signals into the soil, basically telling the specific type of bacteria, rhizobia, hey, we got a hotel for you guys. Basically, it's just like a silly analogy, but and then the microbes are like, oh, sweet. And then so they'll send signals back, like communicating, okay, we're coming. And then so the roots of the bean plant will then like open up, and then the bacteria will go inside, and then they curl up, and that's what these nodules are. It's like pockets of microbes. And so they make a deal that the microbes will offer the plant nitrogen as long as the plant will also provide some carbohydrates to the microbes for their energy source. And so this is just, I think it's an incredibly sophisticated system. I think it's amazing. I could talk about it for hours. And it's just an example of, again, how our people weren't just running around like, just living in the wild as if we weren't doing anything. There was tons of plant management and animal management going on prior to colonization and prior to the influence of colonization. But again, we just have a different language of expressing it. The people that took care of this were just the women. Maybe people wouldn't see them as botanists or ecologists, but in my eyes, I think they are, because they have all the tools and they have all the knowledge to do so. And last but not least, this is called the Ohesera, which is the Karakwinehtha word for cycle of ceremonies. And so this is kind of just an example, again, of just understanding just the cycle of the seasons and plant ecology, and learning when things start to grow based off of the seasons. And then when things start to grow, that's normally when you have some type of gratitude or some celebration for it. So for example, Wahta is maple syrup. And so this is around the time, this is the springtime. And so we usually have like a ceremony that kind of gives thanks to the maple trees for providing this wonderful service, the provisioning of resources, this maple syrup. And the same thing. So it's like there's also in the summer, the strawberry festivals and strawberry ceremonies are very popular as well. And then there's a lot that goes on into each aspect. But I think it's just nice, again, because it's kind of seeing this holistic integration of culture. And this is right. This is natural law. We don't organize ourselves and kind of force nature to accommodate. It's nature occurs, and then we have to fit ourselves in there, and we have to accommodate instead of vice versa. And so the last thing that I'll talk about is kind of just, I think it can be a bit hard to picture what this looks like. How, like, okay, we know what two-eyed seeing is, but how can it literally be integrated, and how can it actually be applied? So one example, this is from actually March of 2020, when I was working as a project support technician at the Kahnawake Environment Protection Office. If you're unfamiliar, Kahnawake is just like not even a 15-minute drive south of Montreal. And this case study, I wasn't a part of the actual study, but I was an employee at the time when they delivered this information session regarding a study that was done. And so when I mentioned before that picture of me at the very beginning, I was in this region called Jorodu, which for other people is just, the English word would just be like the St. Lucie region. And so Jorodu, like I said, is it's a hunting and camping grounds that's reserved only for community members of Kanesdaga and Kahnawake. And it's a place to fish, to hunt, to gather medicines, to pick berries. Nowadays, it's kind of an area to just use your ATV and just like mess around. But people camp there, and it's like a really important place for us. It's a really nice getaway from the urbanization of our communities. And unfortunately, through the years, what a lot of fishermen were noticing was that the brook trout population seemed to be dwindling in a couple of their lakes. And they think that it's attributed to the fact that nowadays there's not really a strict management or fisheries management plan in place at Jorodu. And so there's the concern that a lot of people were going there overfishing because they don't really have like a full background in population ecology, like most people don't. So, and these are just everyday community members, so they might not realize that they're overfishing. And so the people of Kahnawake and the Kahnawake Environment Protection Office grouped up with this environmental consultation group in Montreal, Group Hemispheres, and they provided the actual statistical analyses and the tools and the nets to actually do more of a concrete study. And when they actually did the actual study, when they actually caught the fish and went on in Jorodu and kind of did an analysis of which lakes we're going to do and everything, they made a point to include the Jorodu staff members, the caretakers, as well as some staff members of the CAPO office as well to accompany them, so that it wasn't again some random French white guys, I hate to say it like that, but coming into an indigenous reserve and, telling them this is what's wrong, this is what you have to do, because that would not fly with the people of Kahnawake. There would probably be a lot of tension that would be created if they did it that way. And everybody and the people of Capo knew that from the get-go. So just this idea of partnership and collaboration is really, really important for us. And so it was really nice to hear that that's how the study was conducted. And then afterwards, what had this information session, again, it wasn't, so you had the two consultants from this company that were basically presenting their findings and gave a whole presentation on this is what the criteria we use to choose the lakes to study. This is what we found. These are some stats. These are some graphs. And this is what we came up with a couple of ideas of what to suggest for a management plan. And then and then afterwards they asked like, all right, so what do you guys think? In a room of about maybe 30, 35 Kahnawake and very experienced fishermen. And it was really quiet and it was kind of awkward. And the whole point was that we're supposed to talk now. But I think because again, and this is going a bit into the decolonization of education, which is a whole other really interesting topic. I think this is that format of you had these two men standing at the front of a room and everybody sitting down and staring. And so that doesn't really create the best environment to kind of go and discuss things. That's not the way our people would have big discussions. We're used to sitting in circles and just having conversations. And then that way you end up learning things. And so we ended up we're like, okay, maybe let's just go into breakout rooms, like go into small little groups. And then you guys talk within your groups about what you think, where you think certain management plans can go wrong, where you think non-locals will definitely, locals won't apply because it's kind of tricky to enforce and blah, blah, blah. And so then by the end of it, we ended up it was so nice. I don't really know how else to describe it. It was really awesome being in that room when that happened and kind of just seeing the co-creation of knowledge in action and this really nice cooperation between non-Indigenous scientists and just Indigenous community members, whether they were fishermen or just people concerned about the state of the brook trout in the community. And again, that these scientists made a point. They weren't forcing a management plan on us. They were saying, this is what we notice, this is what we suggest. What do you think? How can we tweak it based off of your knowledge, your many years of fishing in this particular lake in Jorodu? How do you think, you know? And they opened the room for criticism of the actual study and why people might disagree with what the scientists were saying, because they don't, again, if you're using only the Western lens, you only have a partial understanding of something. And the same applied for the Indigenous people, the actual locals. And so I think overall, this is just an example of, you know, in this age of reconciliation and people having misunderstandings of what that actually looks like. And at the end of the day, I think it's all about just creating genuine connection between people, and that it's not one knowledge system is better than the other, um, but just understanding that different people have different experiences, different perspectives. And if you limit yourself to just one, you're going to miss out on a lot of things. And so, again, looking through the world with two lenses of perspective is really the best way to ensure that you get a full understanding of things. And so, as a first year, learning about, you know, these really complex topics in cell biology and organic chemistry, and it kind of seems a bit like, well, how can I incorporate Indigenous knowledge into there? But I think overall it's more of a matter of my perspective has changed a lot, my mindset has changed a lot. And so when I'll be studying something and I feel kind of not very motivated to do so, I just think about, literally, I just get a sense of like gratitude in that this is incredible that I get to study this, because it's one thing to appreciate, for example, the beauty of, you know, from the Indigenous perspective, seeing the beauty of the Three Sisters, and how it could also be a teaching of how communities should work together, right? Like, it's a really beautiful analogy of how people should interact with each other. And then, so that's the cultural part of me that gets satisfied of just the sheer beauty of that whole system and how efficient it is at working. And then there's the scientific technical side of me that also loves learning about the actual microbial symbiosis that's going on in the roots of this. And also in terms of agriculture, just how it's a really great insurance of crop management, because when you do companion planting, if you have a disease that wipes out one plant, you still have two others that are going to be there to provide food for you as well. And then the nutrition part of me that's also fascinated by how the combination of corn, beans, and squash creates like a perfect food, because it has all the major elements that you need to grow. And it's just, it gives you a nice, well-rounded, holistic perspective, especially because science can get a very bad rep of being dry and boring. So I think when you include that personal level, even though that's kind of taboo in science, but when you do bring in this aspect of love and care, it makes the learning process a whole lot more enjoyable, and your understanding is enriched to an extent that wouldn't have been otherwise had you had just stuck to the regular Western way of viewing it. And so that's kind of all I can say, really. I'm putting this slide up if anybody wants to take a picture of it or something, but this is just recommendations for reading. I have yet to actually read these two to the right. I've only read Braiding Sweetgrass, and I loved it. And so I plan on reading these two as well, because it kind of goes into actual medicine as opposed to just environment. And this one as well is more about spiritual practices. Yeah. I think I've talked enough now.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I'll start with a couple of questions. I thought this was wonderful. I love your in-depth explanation of the Three Sisters. I've heard of it before through Vanier's Indigenous education. And we have some words of love already coming in for you. So I'll just share some of that for everyone to see, and we'll get to reading some of those. So, oops, a straight up question here. Well, I don't know how I've just minimized you and I want to make you bigger. Okay, here we go. Okay, so what I'd like to point out is with organizing Women of Science and really trying to, this is the first year that we've had an Indigenous perspective on science. And I'm sorry it took me so long to include it because, and to include speakers. We also had Fran Beauvais who spoke at the beginning of the week. So I don't know why it took me so long. I've had the Vanier Indigenous Education a few years back now, and suddenly it dawned on me that, oh my goodness, I'm missing something. So inclusion and is part of this, and part of the reason that we're doing this with the mission to explain that science is just a tool. And that is really a Western way. And I always felt like it got that what we were sort of working against is that science is for a club. Like you've often said, the old white man kind of club. It does feel like there are barriers to getting into the club, and I understood that this is something we need to break down, and that's just even from a Western point of view. What I found that somewhere along the way in our cultures, from where we began to spread throughout the world as humans, somehow Europeans lost the concept of gratitude, it seems. Maybe like really generally.
Yeah.
Huge general statement, and I'm sorry for that, but, and I shouldn't say but as well as this, like this, as you said, it's language, it's practice, and it's giving thanks and seeing other living things as equal. And this is something that has come out that we've understood by studying the genetic profiles of all living things, that we're all equally evolved. So, like you say, we keep coming around to the truths that Indigenous knowledge is always kind of like, yeah. So thank you for this. I don't know if we have any specific questions. I think we have messages of love coming from everybody here. So I'll get to reading a few of those, and if anybody has a question, our technicians Jamil and Abood will maybe pop in too to maybe help me read some of these, and as well as let us know of questions that might come up. From Jamil, thank you for this entertaining lecture. What a way to end the Women of Science Week. And Russell said, thank you for your time. I appreciate having you today. I like how you interpret the nature in the Indigenous way. Alexandra, she gave a new, to me, and very interesting perspective to science. Thanks. Katya says, thank you so much. The part about seeing the plant as a teacher and then translating its language was eye-opening for me. Me too. Me too.
But and I do have to say as well, a lot of my knowledge of this is heavily based off of the works of Robin Wall Kimmerer. So these are by all means like not like original ideas by me, but from, you know, all the different sources that I pulled and kind of paraphrase what I've read from others. So I just wanted to like specify, like, this is still a very new concept to me and I'm still learning new things about it. So I just didn't want to take credit for that because it would feel wrong.
I find that the more I go into learning and continuing to learn, because teachers can't help but to continue to learn from their students, unless, I don't know, we're some kind of robot, but anyway, in any case, we continue to learn too. And I find that I can't even reference all of where I've got everything. And it's somehow we take in our heroes and make them part of us. And that's, I feel like, how our heroes continue to live. Their knowledge it's not their knowledge, it's everyone's now. And you're participating, that's part of your work. So congratulations, Kailey, because you are continuing, you're planting the seeds that continue to grow. Oh, we have a question here. Someone that's anonymous. I really like the way you view nature's role in the environment and the fact that scientific breakthroughs were never actually breakthroughs, but merely something we've finally seen and understood. So my question, as an outsider perspective, how do you tell apart the difference between an environmental truth that has always been around and a newly discovered truth, especially coming from such a programmed sort of scientific background?
I think it's like I'm thinking, for example, something about cell biology. I happen to be taking that class, but I find that class very interesting because it's a perspective that traditional indigenous knowledge might not have had, because we didn't have microscopes at that time. And so there are definitely, again, there's limitations to indigenous knowledge as well, and Western science often has a lot of tools that help kind of complete the puzzle. But again, I think this whole just the framing of that question, like, how can I tell this from that, reminds me just again of like, we've been so conditioned as humans to have to organize things and separate them. We can't just accept them as is. We have to, right? This is the truth, this isn't the truth. And so I think, like, I don't know. It's a tricky question because it's such a complex topic. Like, there's so much I could break down into it. But I think the way that I view it is the traditional teachings are kind of more generalized. Like, the actual theories have been presented, and that's what we mean when it's indigenous knowledge. Is just being outside of nature is good for the health. And then the discovery, like the tool that Western science plays a role in, is explaining the physiological effects that down to the cellular level, what's going on. And so they both end up saying the same thing. It's just at different scales, if you will, and using different methods of approaching it. And so I mean, like, don't get me wrong, like, I'll still read papers, and it's like, it's not like oh, he said he discovered it, oh, what a fool, like, obviously we still talk like that because that's just our language, but I think it just helps to keep in mind, like, we are the little toddlers in this realm of the world. We, like, definitely get so enthralled in this, the human ego is at the top, and because we've developed the capacity to think and this consciousness, and to build and innovate and stuff like that, we think that means, like, we're better than everything else and that we control it. So I think what I like just about indigenous knowledge is that it kind of, like, this sounds bad, but, like, it puts us in our place, if that makes sense. But not, and even that, not even like in a negative way. It's not like, it's like a shameful, you should have known better, or you should know that you're not this or you're not that. But it's just this basic level of respect for all beings, I think. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but it's kind of a hard question to answer in the first place.
I hope it did. It's a nice elaboration on, and I like the idea of putting us humans in our place. I think our egos are big enough in general.
Yeah.
From Lucienne, thank you so much, Kailey. You had so many interesting points. What do you think think could be done at Vanier to reduce the isolation that Indigenous students might feel at our school? What could teachers do in class?
I mean, having, like, been a part of the Onora, like the Indigenous Student Center there, just having that space was amazing. So it's not necessarily something that students could do, but just in general, if Vanya could keep that up, because it really makes a difference, a feeling like you have a sense of community. I think something, for example, something that I would notice in lectures would be whenever Indigenous people are referenced, it's always in like it'll say the Indians believed that blah blah blah, or Native Americans used to do this. But that kind of creates a bit of what we call like a pan-indigenizing, which is kind of saying like all Native American tribes, like as if they're all the same, but they're so incredibly different. And we might have a lot of similar ideologies, but I feel like when it's worded certain ways, the way that we're talked about is kind of comes off almost as a bit lazy, because it's like, well, which group, which tribe, which nation, what language, which region, like, so I think it's that's something I'd like to see more of, is just like more recognition of that, and kind of like giving credit where credit's due again. But I like I don't know, and it's hard too, because if I'm just thinking about science classes or just classrooms in general, it's kind of hard because it might also differ depending on which student you ask. Yeah, I think just seeing, first of all, if something you are presenting might have roots in Indigenous knowledge, like it's worth researching and it's worth bringing up. Even to get speakers in, like there's a lot of like in terms of plants or something, even to have one little activity where you have like a speaker from Kahnawake come in, because it's so close by, so that'd be pretty convenient. And so even if it doesn't fit, that it's not a scientific presentation, like you're still learning about science by default. And I think as well, like kind of what we talked about in the panel discussion on Wednesday about women in science, is like making a point to talk a bit about the history of it. I think it'd be interesting if all science classes did learn about this concept of we're taught to discredit things that don't have a peer-reviewed academic article about it, but we've seen that that can kind of be a bit of a mistake, and you end up losing out on a lot of important knowledge, or just like take it seriously. Like it's not just folklore, just because it hasn't been studied doesn't mean there's still a basis for it to be used. Yeah, I don't know.
That's great. I think that that can open up our eyes, even just, I think you've opened up our eyes a lot.
Sorry, might I just say as well to Lisi, like the question also has a lot to do with, it seems more in the realm of decolonizing education, which is a whole other, like I said before, it's a whole other topic. Like there's a whole other, PowerPoint presentation that can be made on that and more. But there's books on this. There's a lot of research that's already been done. I'm pretty sure when we did have the reconciliation event at Vanier, it was 2 or 3 summers ago as well. And so that was one example, of ways to decolonize the classroom. And not only does it benefit Indigenous students, but it's been shown that it benefits everybody, because our ways of learning, because they're different, might be a bit more helpful to other people, that the Western academia might not be the way that they learn best, but incorporating different techniques is like the key to really getting a full understanding. And that's the whole idea of everything about today.
I think you're right with that. And Lisi's part of the Universal Learning Task Force, so making things more accessible to all types of learners. And when I've tried to change things around in my classroom, for example, using the talking circles, occasionally, it's almost untraining the teacher in the front of the classroom with the rows is very difficult as well.
Yeah.
Looking around saying, is this okay?
This is
we're sitting in a circle. I haven't done this since daycare or something. And it's like, no, we're having a serious discussion, and I'm not in the front. So yeah, this is a really interesting experience. From someone named Robin, who, Jamil says he finished his comment here. I am new to Canada and thank you for enlightening me with information about the Indigenous people. Kind of like you referred to the or maybe particularly your community. And it was very interesting. And I want to thank you for your time. From Robin, someone named Robin. We don't know if it's, we're not sure. The thing is that Robin Kimmer is who Kailey's been referring to. We don't know if it's that Robin.
Oh, no. This Robin is definitely my mom.
Oh, good. Okay.
From
from a
I can tell by her writing, it's her.
From a youth perspective of presenting, this is very hopeful for the next 7 generations of Indigenous peoples. Women are empowered through you, Kailey. And I hope others are motivated to learn through your storytelling and inclusive way of teaching a flourishing realms of science. That's wonderful. Thank you, Kailey from Gita. I learned a lot from your talk. From Ganesha, I hope we have time to read through all of these. There's, and if anyone has a question, you can always put it in the question answer. And I wonder if some of our technicians would like to help out with some of these comments. Just hop in if you'd like to. From Ganesha, thank you for this beautiful presentation. It was nice to have someone speak about their culture while still including the science part of it. Thank you again, it was inspiring. From Claire, yes, go ahead.
Claire says, awesome talk, Katie. Thanks for helping open my 2 eyes so much wider. I love the Thanksgiving address. I'm already using the braiding sweetgrass book in my New Earth Matters course. But I can't wait to add to the Thanksgiving concepts as well.
Thank you, Claire.
From Dahlia, thank you, Ms. Nicholas, for sharing your knowledge. I think what I love the most is the Three Sisters agriculture. It is so incredibly interesting to see how they all support each other, even if they all have different purposes. Their different purposes all end up coming together and helping each other out. After this meeting, I will definitely be doing my own research on it to learn more about it. Thank you again.
For that, actually, this is totally self-advertisement, but I did write a paper on it there was some science writing competition at Vanier, and I won 2nd or 3rd place or something. So it's on the website. So if you just Google, I'm pretty sure the title is The Agricultural Engineering of the Three Sisters. So if you just search that in my name, it might pop up on the Vanier website.
I'll try and find that and send it to my students.
But also, Braiding Sweetgrass, she has a whole chapter about it. I can't talk enough about this book. I love it.
Abud says, thank you so much, Kailey, for an amazing presentation with mind-blowing ideas. I really like the 2-eyed seeing way. It incorporates both the Western and Indigenous methods, which benefits us ultimately. Thank you for showing us how disconnected we are from nature and how much we need to reconnect. It is very enriching and most definitely an honor to have Indigenous people living so close to us and within our communities, and they should be shown a lot more appreciation.
Thank you. That's really nice.
From Mohammed, for me, it is the fact that how the coexistence of the knowledge of the two peoples creates a perfection in many aspects and allows us to see science we learn in nature and not to have as something that is only theoretical. It was truly inspiring for me.
Nice.
Sammy says, thank you so much for the presentation. It opened my eyes on many aspects on the Indigenous culture and how we have a lot to learn from it. It was really a great moment.
Thank
From
you.
Alicia, she says, thank you so much for your speech. It was good to learn the Indigenous people's culture and the differences between Western culture and Indigenous culture that you call 2-eyed seeing way. I also learned that we should reconnect more to the nature. Thanks so much.
When in doubt.
We have an anonymous question. It says, are there ways for non-Indigenous to get involved or to share experience with Indigenous people?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, and for me, being someone again that's in between. Oh, it's kind of perfect where my posters are because I was just about to say being in between, the indigenous, the indigenous perspective, and then I have a periodic table here. That was an accident, I swear. But the, what I like about Two-Eyed Seeing again is it kind of helps with this reconciliation process because we really do have such a bad history, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people historically, and again it goes back to like that distrust and like some weird tension that could still exist. And like I said, like it's very isolating being an Indigenous person in the sciences because there's not very many. I don't believe there's anybody in my own family that have pursued like environmental science specifically, so it can be kind of hard. um and a part of me almost feels like I have a responsibility as being someone who's um has a foot in both in both worlds to share this. And I love the Two-Eyed Scene because it's really again bridging the gap. It's letting each parties know it's okay, like you can work together, and by working together you're going to benefit each other. Again, I really want to emphasize this isn't me saying Indigenous people are better and our systems are better than the Western ways, like not at all. I think they both have weaknesses and they both have strengths. And so when in terms of like the question specifically, like sometimes what can happen in issue is people say a white researcher wants to study something about Indigenous people. They might have the right intentions, but the way that they do it might come off as kind of disrespectful because that's just the way that they're used to doing it in a Western formal way of doing things. And so something that Indigenous people face a lot in Indigenous communities is like we've been studied to death, but no one's actually talked to us and asked us about it. Right, because the science is very objective and it just goes there, studies it, writes it down, and then it leaves. But I think that when it comes to Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working together, especially in the form of science, I think non-Indigenous people have to really respect and remember, like, you have to build a relationship with us first. This isn't like a business transaction that you're just one knowledge for the other. Like I think it kind of just reminds us to just be like genuine humans again, because the science world can feel so cold sometimes and so unfriendly and void of human emotion and interaction. And that's not really enticing for anybody. And another thing that I like about Two-Eyed Seeing as well is like it's okay to have an emotional connection to what you're doing. It's okay to bring in this aspect because it makes your work so much more enjoyable and it means something to you. And there was an interview, I'm going to talk about her once again, with Robin Wall Kimmerer that she did with The Sun. Incredible article if you want to research that as well. And the way that she worded it was like I think everybody is hungry for this form of doing things, because you could be in the sciences forever and you could excel in it, but it still feels like there's something kind of missing. And maybe that's just me. Maybe people in the sciences do not get that at all. But I think it's necessary to incorporate that. It's like it fulfills something that we're missing because we are human at the end of the day. We're biological creatures. We're not robots that can just be void of emotion. Like we can't help it. And so like why try and repress it and instead use it and incorporate it and use it to your advantage? Again, I don't know if this is answering your question, but
I'm wondering if he or she is asking if there's, I don't know if they're from Montreal, but let's say they're asking for Montreal, how do they go and just learn? Can they go visit the Native Friendship Center or something where they can start to maybe soak in more understanding and make those relationships and connections?
mm-hmm. Well, it's frustrating with COVID right now because even if there was, like a physical thing that could happen, unfortunately we can't. Though there is recently the University of Alberta just came out with this really awesome kind of like just like Understanding Indigenous Peoples of Canada for Everyday Canadians. And it's a free, completely free online course that you could do that really like kind of goes through, I mean, it's all of like Indigenous history of Canada. So there's a lot to go through depending on if you're talking about Métis, Inuit, or First Nations. But I think if you're just curious about learning about that in one way, that's a really good place to start, because this is something that's kind of tricky because you also don't want it to seem like it's our responsibility to teach as well, if that makes sense. And if I may, I'm going to extend this to just when we have conversations about racism. It can be really emotionally exhausting for people of color to constantly feel like they're responsible for educating white people on certain things. And so I think you just have to be mindful of that. Like, it's not like we owe you this knowledge, and just because you're curious means that you could get it like that. Like, you have to earn our respect first if you want to be invited to the community. You know, you can't just walk in and be like, someone teach me, please, because it's kind of, you know, comes off as a little selfish. Like, you're not really recognizing, hey, these people have lives. These people, hey, maybe if they might want financial compensation for all the time that they're giving to do this, you know? So, and this is very generalized. It really depends who you talk to. I'm super open about it. I don't care. Like, I love talking about it because I love educating others about it. Like, whether or not I get an honorarium or not, like, that's not important to me. But for some people, if this is something that they've studied a lot and they have to talk about it constantly, especially if it's like traumatic things about residential school, I think it's safe to say, like, you can't just walk in and ask to know something. You have to like earn it. But that's not to say that we're not friendly. We're definitely always open to collaboration and cultural sharing and stuff. But again, it's just kind of hard with COVID. And I'm not too familiar, I'll be honest, with the way that the Friendship Center works in Montreal, though my mom did work there. So I don't know, Mama, if you want to maybe contribute something in the comments. But
I'll open up your mom's mic in a moment.
so here, let me.
Yeah, she can give us some more information. Just look for Robin.
Yeah, I see her.
Scroll. Okay. Okay, there we go. So
she also just sent me a message saying that on APTN, that's a network that specifically like talks about like Indigenous things in Canada. But if you go on their website online, there's a series. This man named Chuck Hughes, he's a First Nations individual, and he has a segment on the Three Sisters planting.
Oh, okay.
In the Six Nations community. So that's one thing.
Would you mind adding that to our common chat so everyone can see it?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay. Maybe we'll talk about some of the comments more here that we have. I think we were at Rugi. I never thought that people studying in the science field could cause that much trouble to Indigenous people. I never realized how great an impact our research could cause to nature. I am now aware of these serious consequences. Thank you for the enlightenment of the subject. It was very interesting. Great presentation.
Yeah, it's kind of an issue. I feel like I'm talking so much, but there's so much I want to say. I had went to a conference like before COVID had happened in Yukon, and it was all about climate change and First Nations response and adaptation to it. And there was a presentation of this community. They are like from really, really, really up north, like Yukon, like where the glaciers are basically. And there was this weird phenomena that happened in early 2000s where one of the rivers they had literally changed directions. And so scientists were like freaking out because they're like, that's so cool. Like how did it happen? And so obviously a bunch of people from all over the world wanted to come to this community and study it. Very small community, like there's like less than 100 people, and they're like completely self-governed. It's incredible. I have to find the name of it. And I was really shocked because there was community members talking about what had happened, like following that. And there was like reporters coming to their community, and like tons of non-locals just flooded the area. And it's like, they didn't even think to stop and like ask permission. They didn't talk to anybody. They just went there and, you know, we're setting, you know, like setting up things, getting ready to go. And there was only one guy, I think he was like I forget what he was doing, if he was making a film, and he was the only one that actually called their office and was like, hey, how are you? Like, I think it'd be really cool to do that. Like, that's all it takes. It's just, you know, it just recognizes again, like, okay, whoa, like, this is our territory. Like, this is something that we plan to manage. And if you want to study it, we have no problem with it, but ask us first. Like, it's just little things like that that I think people don't realize. I don't know. I find that
Someone
interesting.
walking into your backyard or something.
Yeah, and just like surveying it, like not even saying hello or bye. Like,
this summer, we interviewed Dr. Marianne Falado-Cote, who's an Arctic researcher, and she's developed relationships with the Cree there to help sample the fish that they're catching, and they send them little pieces of the fin to send back for genetic analysis. And she relies on the information that her Cree collaborators can send her and tell her about the traditional. And some of the Cree were saying they're very worried because every once in a while they'll just see a sailboat, someone just cruising through, and or cruise ships, and they don't. It's like cruising through their backyard, and it's like, oh, excuse me, who is that? Gabriella said, thank you so much for sharing. I never thought there would be a way where traditional science and Western science are so tied together. I understand that we have to acknowledge most of Western science that we learn to comes something from our planet, and says that we are more thankful, as you said. Thanks again, very eye-opening. Anna says, I would like to thank you for your time that you've put in order to pass your knowledge about your community to non-Indigenous people. I truly learned a lot of things. It was so interesting to learn about the usage of language and about the Three Sisters agriculture. I wonder if good, thank you, Jamil.
Nelson said, it is very insightful what you mentioned between Western science and Indigenous science. What we lack here is knowledge from other cultures that have been developed and passed down over thousands of years. Modern Western science is, as you said, no different from other sciences as a result from defining in either science through empirical data. I believe that our science may coexist and that schools should reinforce the open thought of it, at the very least, instead of walking strictly on a single path. Rhoda said, thank you for the interesting information, and I am excited to read the books that you had recommended. Nicholas said, thank you for an eye-opening presentation on the struggles Indigenous go through and how over the years we get more and more disconnected from nature. William says, thank you, Kailey, for inviting us about this situation. Kushal said, thank you so much for sharing your depth of knowledge. It was so interesting to hear your Western and Indigenous-based knowledge on science. I was really fascinated with this intimate connection that you shared with nature and this idea of plants being entitled instead of objectifying their view. Ilya said, thank you for this presentation. It was really interesting knowing the difference between the Western and Indigenous ways of science.
Oh yeah, so go ahead. I was gonna help out.
Evelyn said, Kailey, thank you so much for sharing. Please keep in touch with Vani. We need the Indigenous perspective to be integrated into our education system. Please keep being curious and sharing your views.
Mustafa says, thank you, Kailey, for this amazing presentation, especially the two-eyed seeing, and also how important the language is to the Indigenous peoples. As we said, words before all else. We really learned a lot from you today. Thank you again. I think we have so many messages still to read, and we're running out of time here. I think what I'll do is I will send this to you, and we'll save that and send it to you. And Yeah, thank you. It says, thank you. You are very inspiring to all us women. And the three sisters I see being repeated again,
Mhm.
and
So cool.
and also the strong bond between nature and cultures and values. This has obviously touched a lot of us. And I think I can safely say, I think most of us have been changed thanks to you in this moment. And I hope we all carry it forward.
Thank you for listening. This is really nice.
Well, thank you for giving us your time. And I think we shouldn't keep you any longer, or the students any longer, although they would probably like to hear more from you in the future. So please come back to Vanier for other talks.
Of course, one day. I can put my email at the bottom. Just, I don't know if for any reason, it'll be my bishop's one. Oops, wait, no, it's K Nicholas 20. My bad. There you go.
Okay.
For any other further questions.
Okay. All right. So the bottom one is the one that works.
My goodness. Hold on. Final time, and then it'll actually be it. I don't write this one a lot because it's already connected on my email.
Right.
Okay, that's the last one.
Okay.
Oh my god. Final answer.
Wonderful. Well, from all of us, the applause from all of us would be standing. All right.
Oh.
Goodbye, and
so
until the next time we meet again.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
No problem.